Thank you, Artemi, and I would like to thank you for an invitation and also the European University. It's a great pleasure to be here in St. Petersburg. I wanted to make some preliminary remarks about the paper which I'm going to present tonight, which is pretty much of a work in progress. I've been working on Lysenko and Soviet genetics, and more will come out in discussion, I'm sure, from a certain perspective. The perspective is my interest in the connection between Lacanian psychoanalysis and contemporary evolutionary biology from a materialist perspective. So it's a quite original take on this whole debate. I also wanted to specify two other things. First of all, this is a work in progress. I've been working on this for the last, say, 8 months to 1 year. And it's also like a joint project which has started with a friend from Moscow, Oksana Timofeeva. So this is actually the second version of a paper we originally presented at the Historical Materialism Conference in London last November, where I had the pleasure to meet Artemi. And although, of course, as it always happens when you co-write something, although I mostly focused on the Lysenko part and Oksana focused more on the early Soviet culture and then the post-Soviet perestroika responses to that early Soviet culture, what I'm going to do today, to give you a right context for the discussion then, is to go through also the part which is more on early Soviet culture and then move on to Lysenko and then make some final remarks on what I think is the generally, to put it in these terms, reactionary responses to very generally speaking, speculations about animals and plants from the early 20th century through the Stalin years and then, of course, the post-Soviet period. Now, I want to start with two, again, I think provocative is again the right adjective, two provocative quotations, and they come from two very different authors, but I think they well capture the critical, of course, the critical tone of the presentation and also my use of Lysenko. Of course, I'm not trying to be a blunt, straightforward supporter of Lysenko. I'm using Lysenko critically to return to some quite well-known debates about evolutionary biology and the critique of genetics, of the genetics that came out of the so-called great synthesis of the 1930s in Western Europe, a debate which has been started, I would say, as early as the 50s and 60s with big names like, for instance, Stephen Jay Gould. Okay? The two quotations come, the first comes from Wilhelm Reich, the psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich, we could say the early Wilhelm Reich, that is to say before he moved to the United States and according to some became a psychotic. The second comes from a quite well-known, well-known full stop evolutionary biologist, that is to say Richard Levontin, who collaborated with Stephen Jay Gould in the 70s on a number of technical biological papers and then became a very open critic of what he calls the ideology of DNA and the ideology of genetics. So, first quote from Wilhelm Reich from Dialectical Materialism Psychoanalysis, a text of the late 20s. Reich writes, "Future dialectical materialist theories of science will probably not retain much of current theories of heredity, 1928, which constitute a unique source of strength for the whole of the bourgeois conception of civilization. They are mostly founded, these theories of heredity, on moral value judgments and contain few scientific elements." End of quote. The second epigraph, the second quote, comes again, as I said, from Richard Levontin. Quite blunt, he writes, "Genes can make nothing." Now, the paper, as I said before, is the starting point, to give you a more general background, of a collaborative research project that aims to develop, I would say, a new dialectical materialist philosophical approach to subjectivity and human nature in their relation to science, psychoanalysis, and politics. My background is in philosophy, even though I've been working mostly in the last 10 years on psychoanalytical theory and the connections with science. In this paper, I will briefly outline two opposite, as it were, politics of nature, and the way in which they inform the process of the production of subjectivity in early Soviet and early post-Soviet ideological narratives. I will analyze fictional representations of human, animal, and vegetative life as epitomized by the contrasting stances of Andrei Platonov's revolutionary writings and the perestroika culture's reactionary responses to them, as well as scientific attitudes towards nature, namely the debates surrounding Lysenkoism and Soviet biology. And as I said, the Platonov and early revolutionary culture part of the paper and the project is mostly Oksana's work, whereas I mostly focused on the debates surrounding Lysenkoism in the 30s, but also then in the last 20 years. There are people being published by MIT Press in biological theory who do write about Lysenko. I mean, this is just to say I'm not the only one trying to return to these debates, and actually maybe my exceptional position is that I'm not a scientist, whereas a number of well-considered scientists are returning to these debates. After the October Revolution of 1917, the standards of a revolution in nature and even a struggle against nature were raised in all spheres of the nascent Soviet society. In the spirit of a revolutionary utopia, nature was supposed to be changed, both liberated from its reliance on necessity and preserved from the precariousness of its contingency. So you also had a debate, very open debate, as you may know, on the relativity of any clear-cut divide between notions of necessity in nature and notions of contingency. And this is, again, a very topical issue in contemporary European philosophy. Think of Kenton Meyasu's best-selling book, After Finitude, which is actually a problematization of notions of necessity and contingency from, I would say, a post-structuralist Badiou influence perspective. A diffuse avant-garde attitude unconditionally sustained the idea of a point of no return, a giving up the ship, as it were, a total transformation of the social and natural order towards emancipation and equality. Nature was also considered as a battlefield for class struggle. The active transformation of one species into another, e.g. of animals into humans, but also vice versa, accompanied by the acquisition of higher levels of consciousness and freedom, are themes that run through the Soviet literature, fictional literature to begin with, and poetry of the period. As the futurist writer Velimir Klebnikov puts it, yeah, you should correct me. I quote, "I see freedom for horses and equal rights for cows." In his poem, The Triumph of Agriculture, Nikolai Zabolotsky, one of the founders of the Russian avant-garde absurdist group Oberyu, describes nature as suffering under the old bourgeois regime, compares explicitly animals with proletarians, and creates a utopia of their progressive liberation facilitated by technology. And I quote the poem in English, I'm sorry. Maybe you should have provided the translation, but this is a quite good translation. It's been translated quite well. "I saw a red glow in the window belonging to a irrational ox. The parliament of ponderous cows sat there engaged in problem solving. Down below the temple of machinery, manufacture oxygen pancakes. There, horses, friends of chemistry, had polymeric soup. Some others sailed mid-air, expecting visitors from the sky. A cow in formulas and ribbons baked pie out of elements, and large chemical oats grew in protective coats. So they almost preserved the rhymes in English. Now, naturally, Andrei Platonov deserves special attention in this respect. Animality occupies a central place in Platonov's prose. He's able to read on animal faces the suffering and the hopes of a secret, sad, and unknown human being. And here I think, as always, when you collaborate with somebody, I have some doubts about Platonov because I'm not completely sure that his description of this emancipatory animal, almost a proletarian human being hidden beneath the skin of the animal, is not a certain form of humanism, of quite naive humanism. So I'm also sharing with you the tensions we have in this project. According to Oksana, no, it is anthropomorphism, but also in a sense a certain humanism, that is to say, like non-mediated anthropomorphism, but also anthropocentrism. So it goes back to the debates concerning the early Marx. Is it in a naive anthropocentrism? Is it not? Etc., etc. Platonov's animal is a man in disguise, tortured by his unrecognized intellect, imprisoned in his natural body. While in his letter on humanism, famously, Heidegger writes about the unsurpassable abyss, gap, separating animals from humans, the protagonist of Platonov's The Sea of Youth thinks that the gap between humans and other beings has to be overcome by means of communist revolution. And communist revolution has to continue, if not accelerate, Darwinian evolution, and thus ultimately liberate animals from their very animality. In Platonov, not only humans, but all living creatures, including plants, are overwhelmed by the desire for equality, a desire which, as Frederick Jameson, writing about Platonov, pointed out, has not yet found its Freud or Lacan. A passage from Chevengur is emblematic in this regard, and I quote Platonov. Czepurny touched a bardock. The bardock too wanted communism. The entire weed patch was a friendship of living plants. Just like the proletariat, this grass, the weed, endures the life of heat and the death of deep snow. End of quote. The desire for communism and equality originates from a profound boredom, the Russian toska. That is, from the unbearableness of the existing, fixed, unchangeable order of things. We should change the world as soon as possible, Platonov's Bolshevik says, otherwise even animals will eventually get mad. But again, this transformation follows the way of a struggle against nature, if not a struggle against the dialectic of nature, which is to be implemented by means of technology. As Platonov writes in his short essay on socialist tragedy, and I quote, it's a quite long quote, but interesting, the situation between technology and nature is tragic, Platonov says. The aim of technology, give me a place to stand and I will move the world. But the construction of nature is such that it does not like to be beaten. Nature keeps itself to itself. It can only function by exchanging like for like, or even with something added in its favor. But technology strains to have it the other way around. I'm still quoting. The external world is protected from us by a dialectic. Therefore, though it seems like a paradox, the dialectic of nature, I think this is the crucial point in the quote, the dialectic of nature is the greatest resistance to technology and the enemy of humankind, Platonov writes. Technology is intended for and works towards the overturning or softening of the dialectic. So far, it has only modestly succeeded, and so the world still cannot be kind to us. I conclude with the quotation. Platonov writes, important passage, at the same time, the dialectic alone is our sole instructor. So dialectic in the end is recuperated, not only opposed to technology. The dialectic alone is our sole instructor and resource against an early, senseless demise in childish enjoyment, just as it was the force that created all technology. So to sum up the quote, not only what seems to be at first sight an opposition between nature and the dialectic of nature and technology is described by Platonov, but also this opposition between nature and the dialectic of nature and technology is itself dialectical. I think this is the point. The image of a new dynamic science that would contrast the status quo of old bourgeois science and the great expectations early Soviet culture had from the achievements of revolutionary technology were certainly not confined to the fields of literature and poetry, about which I spoke so far. In 1931, Yakovlev, the then Commissar of Agriculture, could claim that imminent discoveries will, quote, revolutionize the life of animals and plants. So this narrative, which you find in early Soviet culture, especially literature and avant-garde poetry, is also present in the explicit and official statements of the Soviet regime. I have another quote from the Commissar from Yakovlev. This is more specifically targeted at the Lysenko debate, about which I will start to talk in a bit. Yakovlev says, this is from 1933, we are, quote, in fact approaching the art of transforming the plant according to our will, end of quote. Such statements were meant to overcome skepticism and include elements of what up to that point had appeared to be fiction into science. So my general point here is that actually a certain discourse is well beyond what seems to us to be an unsurmountable divide between fiction, if not poetry, science, and at the same time official politics. Class struggle is also a struggle in and against nature. Scientists themselves believed that socialism would have constructed a new relation between science and life. Of course, this is actually also, this whole debate, I think, doesn't necessarily have to be related to the genetic debates of the 30s, agrobiology and genetic debates of the 30s in the Soviet Union, but of course, it's also a debate that was originated earlier on from Stalin's dazzled with success. I mean, the more sort of like utopian and optimistic cultural propaganda of Stalin in those years. And dazzled with success, how do you translate that? Dazzled with success.
Same as be successful, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's like caught by success, like excited by success. I move on to Lysenko. Richard Levins and Richard Levontin opened their 1985, we are in the Reagan years in the United States, opened their 1985 seminal volume, The Dialectical Biologist, printed by Princeton University Press, with the following daring epigraph, quote, to Frederick Engels, they write, who got it wrong a lot of the time, but who got it right where it counted, end of quote. The central thesis the two renowned scientists, then respectively professors of population sciences and of zoology at Harvard University, they are quite well-known guys, the central thesis they put forward in their book is that a dialectical analysis is needed, quote, as a critique of the current state of biological theory, end of quote. A Marxist dialectic, they say, which unveils the fact that scientific and political questions are inextricably interconnected, dialectically related. This comes from 1983-84 American scientists, well-known scientists. Actually, if you take it out of context, it could come from the late 20s or early 30s Soviet literature I was referring to before. I think when I came across this book, and it's a well-known book, it generated a lot of debates in the 80s and 90s, and then it was a bit forgotten. But I know of at least 3 or 4 people who, from different perspectives now, are working on this volume, the dialectical biologist. Outside of science, I'm talking about social sciences and psychoanalysis and politics. Moving from these premises, one of the most interesting chapters of the book of the dialectical biologist by Levins and Leventin is dedicated precisely to a reassessment, they call it, an objective reassessment of the Lysenko case, of Lysenkoism more in general. Rather than focusing on the personal vicissitudes of the notorious agronomist who, thanks to Stalin's personal support, managed to make Soviet biology officially reject genetics, as you know, in 1948, the book, The Dialectical Biologist, tackles Lysenkoism as a widespread, they call it, Soviet mass movement of the 1930s. To emphasize their shift of perspective, aimed at avoiding the simplistic totalitarian interpretation which tends to obscure the scientific and rational aspects of the Lysenko episode, Levins and Leventin propose what I find convincing comparison with Stakhanovism. So let's not focus on Lysenko as the barefoot professor and his personal, of course, by now we know, very close connection with Stalin. Let's focus on what was going on within and outside the university discourse in those years and what are the reasons, the sociological, intellectual, but also scientific reason why, in a sense, Lysenkoism triumphed. So you get the point. I mean, a number of books were written about Lysenkoism, both in Western Europe and even in Soviet Russia after 1962. There's the famous volume by Medvedev, a scientist himself. They all tend to actually focus on kind of sociological analysis of the so-called personality cult. That is to say, look, when you are actually living in a completely totalitarian regime, this is what happens to science. That is to say, science is completely subjected to politics. So in a sense, they take Lysenko to relate to Stalin in the same way as Rosenberg related to Hitler, for instance. I think what Levins and Leventin do, and they were the first but not the only ones, now there are historians of science working a lot on this issue, they're trying to say, of course there was a personality cult, of course there were the purges and people like Vavilov were sent to the Gulag, but this is not the whole issue. How do we deal with the fact that what will be in a few decades the second technological power of the world, able to send, well, we are here in Gagarinskaya, able to send somebody in space.
It's a Count Gagarin.
Oh, really? So that was a mistake, yeah. They're not related. They're not related. That was my projection then. It was quite a good projection. So their point of view is like, yes, of course, there was such thing as the personality cult, and that influenced in the Stalin years, and even in the Khrushchev year, because in a sense Lysenko had more power during the Khrushchev year. I think in terms of historical research, this is quite proved after 48, after the Genetic Congress of 48, the Anti-Genetic Conference of 48. This is a matter of fact. Of course, the personality cult influenced the relation and the liberty of scientists and their relation with politics, but this is not the whole story. How can we account for the fact that a freak, as somebody called him, was able to actually create a biology or a biological theory which, in spite of all its weaknesses, tried to completely detach itself from Western biology? How was that able to happen? How was it able to make that happen, and the movement itself and the regime was able to make that happen at the same time when, of course, the Soviet Union was able to after a couple of decades, but if we're talking about the main years of Lysenkoism, the 50s, when that was the real establishment, how do the two things can happen together? Okay, and I think this is a much more interesting question in terms of the history of science, to say the least. So Richard Levinson, Richard Levantine, in terms of history of science, propose a convincing comparison with history of science and history of sociology, we can say, with Stakhanovism. Like Stakhanovism, Lysenkoism, at least in the 30s, before it became completely establishment-based, Lysenkoism was, according to them, in its early stages, characterized by a strong anti-elitist and populist element. Not only was the Lysenko movement an attempt at a scientific revolution, but, and I quote, they say, an incipient cultural revolution. They don't develop that, but they make a quite clear connection as scientists to certain debates that were circulating in Maoist China during the Cultural Revolution. It was an attempted and failed incipient cultural revolution that completely failed, a fiasco, and they recognized that. In other words, according to Levinson Levantine, the Lysenkoist attack on crucial aspects of Western bourgeois science, such as the metaphysical assumption of heredity theory, the standardization of statistical methodology in biology and the social sciences, and the dissociation of the life sciences from philosophy, all things we live with right now. The attack of Lysenkoism on these aspects of Western bourgeois science is for them inextricable from a class conflict, a very clear class conflict between self-taught, barely literate plant breeders from peasant origins, such as Lysenko himself, and pure geneticists, who had not, most of them, endorsed the Bolshevik Revolution, but nonetheless still retained considerable power in Soviet academia. So, if I may contextualize this point Levinson Levantine do from a more psychoanalytical Lacanian perspective, I think their point is that, in a sense, the Lysenkoist movement in the 30s, when the battles, the theoretical battles were being fought in the Soviet Union about genetics, should be taken as an attempted revolution, an attempted cultural attack against the university discourse. An attack on the university establishment as such. And the fact that, in a sense, the positions of power still in Stalinist Soviet Union of the 30s in the life sciences were actually were still occupied by people who had either not endorsed at all the Bolshevik Revolution or endorsed the revolution at a late date. Of course, the other point here is that if Lysenkoism was in the end a fiasco, and it clearly was, it's because it's very difficult, and I think also not that useful, to distinguish between its early stages where it launched an attack against the university discourse and the moment at which, and we could say, after 1948, when genetics was more or less formally forbidden, the moment at which Lysenkoism became the epitome of the university discourse, okay? So in a sense, like, it's an attack on the university discourse which led to an even more, how should I put it, solid, rigid, and non-transparent establishment of a certain university discourse, which is one with, which becomes one with political power. Now, what I've said so far is about two scientists, Levinson Levantine, very famous, and my way of reading them. The other reference about which I will talk for the next 5 to 10 minutes is quite different. It comes from a pamphlet written by, in 1977, a pamphlet written by, it's unsigned, but we know who wrote it, by the Union Communiste de France Marxiste-Léniniste, which maybe doesn't tell you much, but it was, in those years, Alain Badiou's political Maoist movement in France. It's a pamphlet entitled Contre les cours et Althusser. Les cours, historian of science, Marxist, very close to the French Communist Party, wrote what is arguably, to date, the most convincing, for some, attack on Lysenkoism, okay? So this is a pamphlet against Lecour, whom Badiou associates with Althusser and the PCF, the French Communist Party. So it's, in a sense, very similar for me, the points, as you will see, they make from this more openly political perspective, Maoist perspective, and as philosophers, the point they make is strangely, oddly enough, quite close in 1977 to the point the American scientists make from a scientific perspective 8 years later. Okay? And remember, the Lysenko case in France had huge repercussions on intellectual life in the early 1950s. Okay? We know that especially, for instance, from writings of Jacques Monod, Nobel Prize winner for medicine, geneticist in the early 60s. Jacques Monod, himself a Communist Party member, left the party in the early 50s because the party actually tried to impose Lysenkoism in France to basically its scientific members, okay? There's a very nice exchange of letters between Aragon, so completely different context, of course, surrealism, post-surrealism, and Jacques Monod himself, and Aragon trying to convince Monod that he should stay in the party and endorse Lysenkoism, which he didn't do, of course. And Monod became one of the most outspoken in the 50s, even before gaining international notoriety with his research in. He's the father of, we could say, cellular, microcellular and cellular biology. Okay, so it's the beginning of cutting-edge research that still goes on enzymes, etc., today. And of course, maybe you know Monod from his 1968 more philosophical book, L'hasard de la nécessité, Chance and Necessity. So it's a whole scientific discussion of the notions of contingency and necessity in science, which was very, very famous in the early 70s in Western Europe. Now, as I said, a very similar point to the one made by the two American scientists about the class struggle component of Lysenkoism and its attempt at promoting a cultural revolution in science is made from a more openly political perspective in a 1977 pamphlet of the Union Communiste de France Marxiste-Léniniste, the militant group led in those years by Alain Badiou, entitled Contre Lecour et Althusser. So against Lecour and Althusser's, according to them, revisionist identification of Lysenko with a charlatan pseudoscientist, a delirious puppet of Stalin, the text strongly claims that the vehement debates on agrobiology and genetics in the USSR of the 30s and early 40s pose nothing less than, quote, the pamphlet, the question of the relationship between proletarian revolution and scientific practice. The pamphlet continues, still quoting, the class struggle concerning science, unveiled by Lysenkoism, they write, is still here today, now, an integral part of class struggle as a whole. 1977, France. More specifically, given that the Bolshevik Revolution, they write, did not overcome the bourgeois academic establishment, same point I made before with regard to the two scientists, Lysenkoism should be understood as a rank and file endeavor to orient research towards the need of the people by replacing the university discourse with a truly dialectical materialist approach. If the Chinese, they call it themselves, if the Chinese, in the sense of cultural revolution, if the Chinese consciousness of this revolutionary movement in the end led to a huge, colossal fiasco, they acknowledge that openly, of course, and even transformed itself to its opposite, this only happened because the movement did not continue to adhere to the dialectical principle according to which science is a movement, a process. That is to say, the articulation of the contradictions among which scientists must recover the contradiction, man-nature, and class contradictions. So I think, to put it more generally, their point, which is very similar, as we will see in a while, I'll return to this point, to the point that Richard Levinson and Richard Levontin make, the problem, the theoretical problem with Lysenkoism that then led to its complete identification with personality cult and establishing Stalinism is that he or they didn't understand that dialectical analysis in the life sciences and in sciences in general should be taken as a critique of scientific ideology, not the advancement of specific theses to be opposed to other theses. In this case, specific anti-bourgeois genetic thesis to be opposed to what was perceived to be bourgeois genetics, that is to say, the Mendelian, Morganian interpretation of genetics, and then, of course, of Darwinian theory as a whole. In other words, Lysenkoism ended up founding the general opposition between proletarian and bourgeois science on specific contents, this is the point, on conflicting scientific theses. This is the problem that Badiou and his comrades identify with Lysenko. And Levinson and Levitin say something quite similar. I mean, the problem with a dialectical analysis of, in this case, genetics, turning into a new Uber university discourse is the following. As soon as you start promoting specific conflicting scientific theses, I give you an example. Of course, what in terms of the basic genetics of the 30s, remember, like this is like the early stages of research on genetics. Of course, Lysenkoism was almost obliged, even though there are some contradictory stances there, to recognize the existence of chromosomes. They could be seen, okay? What it didn't recognize was the existence of genes, in a sense. And at that point, it was still not a contentious issue, but of course, even in Western Europe, and we can, Western world and Western Europe especially, we can discuss this later on, there were still attempts to actually merge certain trends of late Lamarckism with the Morganian Mendelian genetic approach to Darwinian theory, okay? So the point here I'm making is basically that according to Badiou and his comrades, the idea is that as soon as Lysenkoism tried to say, okay, we think the chromosomes exist, but paired genes on paired alleles, well, that is not the case. And this is like non-bourgeois science, okay? That is when a dialectical analysis, a dialectical critique of the life sciences become nothing but a reinstantiation, a repetition, if not a strengthening of the ideology it attempts to criticize. In doing so, Badiou and the others write, Lysenkoism became very quickly a vulgar form of evolutionism that wrongly associated universal class struggle with the obtainment of isolated results. That's the point, in a sense. Conflicting scientific theses, we do not believe in the existence of genes or the location of genes in this specific part of the chromosomes, and if you do believe in that, you are actually upholding bourgeois science. When you are taking that road, but you and the others seem to be suggesting, that is to say, when you're looking for the obtainment of isolated results to be opposed to what is mainstream ideological science, you are on the wrong track. This is where your dialectical analysis becomes something completely different, if not opposite, to what dialectical analysis should be. As I said before, it must be noted that Levins and Levitin, the two scientists, draw a very similar conclusion when they state, and I'm quoting from them, I think this is pretty much the point I've been making for the last couple of minutes. The error of the Lysenkoist claim, they write, arises from attempting to apply a dialectical analysis of physical problems from the wrong end. Dialectical materialism in the sciences is not and has never been a programmatic method for solving particular physical problems, say about chromosomes. Rather, dialectical analysis provides an overview and a set of warning signs against particular form of dogmatism and narrowness of thought, end of quote. You see, in this sense, Levinson-Levantine, from a scientific standpoint, and Badiou and his comrades, from a more political standpoint, I think end up with a very similar point. That is to say, dialectical analysis applied to life sciences is most of all, if not exclusively, a form of critique of scientific ideology. And if you go beyond that, if you go beyond the level of critique, then you are in deep trouble. And this is what happened with Lysenkoism. This is the kind of analysis they seem to propose. Now, let me move to my own interest in Lysenko on the basis of what I just said. In light of these considerations, my overall claim is that there is still today, clearly in post-Soviet times, a communist Lysenkoist political legacy in the domain of biological dialectical materialism that philosophy should appropriate after learning the hard lesson of what did not work with Lysenko in the USSR. To paraphrase the quote from the two scientists about Engels I read out before, I would say provocatively, Trofim Denisovich Lysenko got it wrong most of the times, but sometimes, few times, got it right where it really matters. Generally speaking, this appropriation should first of all relate the Lysenkoist attempted cultural revolution in biology to a prestigious tradition of materialist speculation in the life sciences, itself driven by a powerful political vision that brings together the likes of, again, Jacques Monod and Stephen Jay Gould. What I'm saying is, of course, I referred to Monod earlier as one of the most outspoken critics of the Lysenkoist establishment in the 50s. Nevertheless, my point is that critically, one can return to Lysenko, in a sense insert the attempted cultural revolution we've been talking about in the sciences within a kind of long-term genealogy of materialist speculation in the life sciences. And very, very generally speaking, what I'm saying is that one could start with the dialectics of nature and the anti-Düring and make connections up to the late Stephen Jay Gould and see what has been a number of trends that have been consistently, of course, in different cultural contexts and in more or less objectively valid scientific fashion, have been consistently trying to criticize the idealist and metaphysical assumptions on which evolutionary theory, if not more generally biology, relies and still relies. As Richard Levantine, same scientist but in another book called The Doctrine of Dna, it's a 1993 book, as Levantine puts it in his polemical manifesto, The Doctrine of Dna, at present, biology continues to be possibly more than ever an ideology. It's just enough to open the papers and usually we discover things such as new scientific research in the United States has identified the gene responsible for usually schizophrenia and homosexuality. That's the main...
Religion reason.
Exactly, exactly. So as Levantine puts it in his polemical manifesto, biology at present continues to be possibly more than ever an ideology. Contra the likes of Richard Dawkins and the advocates of sociobiology and biological determinism, who more or less silently, in my opinion, perpetuate the most reactionary assumptions of 20th century eugenics, Levantine claims that, again, my epigraph, genes can make nothing. What does it mean? Well, it means that, quote, isolating the gene as the master molecule and the genome is another unconscious ideological commitment, end of quote. This doesn't mean that Levantine is saying at Harvard, genes do not exist. No, of course. He's just saying isolating the gene as the master molecule is another unconscious ideological commitment. Okay? Thinking that specific traits, phenotypic traits, depend exclusively on a certain genotype is an ideological commitment. And we can return to this in the discussion because there's a lot going on in so-called Evo-Devo theory, evolutionary developmental theory, right now in the first decade of the year 2000, that has problematized not only, of course, the way in which individual phenotypes can be, of course, changed and manipulated by the environment, But the very assumption that heredity is just a matter of genes is right now, in a lot of cutting-edge biological philosophy and also experimental biology, a topic which is being discussed. So we are not going back to the transmission of acquired traits, you know, the usual giraffe example, Lamarckian example. It's not that easy. Of course, these scientists are not saying Lamarck was right, but there are tendencies, and they tend to define themselves as neo-Lamarckians. There are new debates in scientific circles that, in my opinion, go back to debates which were not specifically debates concerning Lysenkoism, but which allowed, in a sense, the Lysenkoists to criticize. So these are debates that precede Lysenko of the late 20s and 30s. These debates, in a sense, which try to find a medium position between Darwinian evolutionary theory and neo-Lamarckian elements, and consequently criticize what became in the 30s with the great synthesis, but is still now today, the reigning ideology of genetics, that is to say, the so-called Mendel-Morgan paradigm, for which basically genes are everything. I mean, the phenotype is completely dependent on genotype, and heredity is a matter of what? Of mutations are the consequence of genes, random variation happening, random mutation happening over hundreds of thousands of years. Okay? This is pretty much put into doubt by cutting-edge contemporary evolutionary theory. Not just evolutionary theory, but as I said before, evolutionary developmental theory, and we can return to this in the discussion. Lysenko, of course, and just want to make this clear, was wrong. Lysenko went obviously too far, for instance, when he refused to acknowledge the existence of paired genes lodged in paired chromosomes, not to mention his acolytes, his followers' claim that they were able to transform wheat into rye in a single step, or that, quote, 3 generations of socialism will so change the genes as to make all races look equal, end of quote. Of course, Lysenko and the Lysenkoists were wrong, but more recent discoveries, we're talking about the last 30 years and even more the last decade, increasingly indicate that although we are certainly influenced and limited by our genes, differences in phenotype, including differences in neuronal connections, we're talking about epigenetics here, are in equal measure the result of genes and developmental environment, and also a good amount of sheer contingency. I call it like that from a philosophical standpoint. The technical term would be developmental noise, that is to say the random variation in growth and division of cells during development. Clearly, to date, what I've just talked about is not, by and large, the sort of information the general public finds in popular scientific magazines or television documentaries, which invariably focus on the identification of that gene for that behavior, that gene for that trait, or more technically, that gene for that phenotype. Furthermore, and I come from to the more philosophical point I want to make, from a more theoretical perspective, I believe that philosophy should return, a materialist philosophy should return to and re-elaborate Lysenko's unabashed challenge to the unspoken metaphysical, i.e. idealist and vitalist presuppositions of genetics and evolutionary theory. Not all of it, but mainstream Mendelian, Morganian approach to evolutionary theory. This is, of course, not a straightforward critique of Darwin. And remember, Lysenko and the Lysenkoists never qualified themselves as Lamarckians, never. They called themselves creative Darwinists. So, of course, what I'm trying to say here is that from a more theoretical perspective, I'm interested in Lysenko's and the Lysenkoists' critique of what they call the idealists themselves, assumptions of genetics and evolutionary theory. Why? Well, because they're still with us today. In my vision, in a sense, like to speak of a selfish gene, Dawkins, or also certain debates in the philosophy of mind, I'm making the name here of Daniel Dennett, in a sense they all share the same metaphysical view about genes and the mind. Okay? And of course I'm not the first to make this point. The big debate between Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins was precisely about that. You cannot reify something like the mind. The mind is not a thing. Okay? And you cannot speak of causation in philosophical terms when you are talking about the relationship between genes and specific phenotypic traits. So this is something which has been debated in the philosophy of biology for the last 25, 30 years. From a more philosophical perspective, thinkers such as Davide Tarizzo is a biopolitical thinker, not well known outside of Italy. I think he will become well known now. Some of his books are being translated by Stanford University Press. I think the Agamben and Negri generation is being replaced by a newer and more interesting generation. So thinkers such as Davide Tarizzo have recently shown how classical Darwinism, so this is also Darwin himself, is itself a metaphysics insofar as it relies on what? Well, on the notion of autonomous life. I quote Tarizzo, Darwinian biology consists of what is undoubtedly a set of scientific theories which are nonetheless brought together under a metaphysical indicator, which is what? The abstract idea that is life as such. End of quote. In other words, Darwinian biology and vitalism share the same conditions of possibility. This is Tarizzo's point in a nutshell. The life sciences are ultimately based on the a priori thesis according to which each and every form of life, each and every living being is nothing else than a transitory instantiation of what is in the end the continuous energy called life. According to Tarizzo, such a metaphysical framework entails a series of insidious implications which are, at a closer inspection, inherently political, or even better, biopolitical. If life is a will to live that as such intends to live more and more, then the strengthening of the force of life will express precisely the freedom of the vital self. As Daniel Dennett problematically has it, and I'm paraphrasing Dennett, freedom appeared in the word, it's incredible he said something like that, freedom appeared in the word in concomitance with the emergence of life. This is his argument. And the criterion thanks to which we can assess whether a living being is improving, he says that, getting better, is the gradual increase of its natural liberty, which is in turn, according to Dennett, an increase in its chances of survival. This is like mainstream, very respected philosophy of mind, Daniel Dennett. In brief, I'm paraphrasing what Dennett says, the word of autonomous life is the word of a permanent war. It is only a short step from here to what Tarizzo himself calls the racism of autonomous life, the racism of the freedom to live, the racism of men to come. As Tarizzo concludes, we should therefore not be satisfied, and it was the debate promoted, I think, by Stephen Jay Gould in the 70s and 80s, we should not be satisfied with any simplistic distinction between a good and neutral scientific Darwinism and a bad and proto-fascist social Darwinism. This is too simple, since they both underlie the same reactionary idealist metaphysics. Bearing in mind the important fact that Lysenko always criticized Mendelian genetics in the name of a new created Darwinism, which would be able to conceive of dialectical jumps in evolution. And, you know, the jumps in evolution, which of course Lysenko formulated in a very crass, simple way, it's the usual dialectical materialist argument of the transformation of quantity into quality. That was put in very blunt and stupid terms. But think about very well notion Stephen Jay Gould again of punctuated equilibrium. That is to say, not actually following any longer Darwin when he speaks about appearances, for instance, of new species in terms of a continuum, but thinking of evolution also from the perspective of what Gould called a saltational paradigm, saltational jump. You know, it's literally the same thing. I'm not saying that these debates, as discussed by Gould, are not doing nothing but repeating Lysenko. That would be stupid of me. But I'm saying that you can see from a philosophical perspective that these debates, contemporary debates, debates of the last 20 years, do have a certain genealogical connection with debates that surrounded the Lysenko affair. So my point is basically, as there are scientists today that can define themselves both Darwinians and neo-Lamarckians, which doesn't mean that they are actually applying Lamarck to the letter, the same could be said with regard to Lysenko. This is my point. So bearing in mind the important fact that Lysenko was always criticized Mendelian genetics in the name of a new creative Darwinism, which would be able to conceive of dialectical jumps in evolution, the transformation of quantity into quality. Should we not give a new meaning to catchphrases such as, and these are catchphrases for Lysenko himself, and present was the, as you know, probably the philosopher standing back and supporting Lysenko. Should we not give new meaning to catchphrases of the Lysenkoists, such as the shattering, they call it, or shaking of heredity, or more to the point, if you actually have read Catherine Malabou and her work on plasticity, what the Lysenkoists themselves called the plasticity of genes with regard to the environment. Now, I could go on for some other 10, 15 minutes, or should we stop? Because this... You can go on. Okay. Of course, this central part of the paper is the one I personally care the most. But now I would like to move on and actually conclude with some consideration about, again, the possibility of interspecies change, and of course the narratives, the logical narratives surrounding animals, plants, but also classes, social classes in human beings in the post-Soviet period. And again, here I'm deeply indebted to Oksana Timofeeva because this is mostly her part of the job. Lysenkoism was, of course, is, of course, now defamed as a black spot on red biology. Of course, it's recognized that Soviet biology was achieved a lot. Of course, the name of the likes of Oparin have never been discarded by Western biology, but Lysenkoism is a kind of black spot on red biology. And is supposed to provide some of the most striking arguments against the applicability or even the link between politics and natural science. So natural science and politics should be separated always, otherwise the risk is to fall back into something similar to Lysenkoism. Since the perestroika years, if not earlier, the figure of Lysenko has been used as a scapegoat embodying all the sins of Soviet totalitarianism as seen from the perspective of science. We find reference of this in mass culture and even rock music, for instance, in Andrew Makarevich's songs, Weeds Generate Weeds, produced in 1991, the year of the end of the Soviet Union. Of course, I didn't know this. Oksana just passed it on to me, but I think it's really, really good to see the change of the Lysenko signifier, we could say, in the post-Soviet years. Quote from the song, "Disagrees were becoming shooting marks. Everyone could be put against the wall. Academic comrade Trofim Lysenko taught us to change the world. A king being drunk with his lies, he was waiting for miracles from earth and skies. But weeds generated weeds. White bread didn't grow out from weeds. Wolves generate wolves. A tender fellow deer won't grow up from a wolf cub. Worms generate worms. A proud falcon won't grow up from the worm. Weeds generated weeds. Wolves generated wolves. Worms generated worms." It is difficult not to contrast this depressed and depressing post-Soviet weed with Platonov's friendly weed, passionate with communist desire. Remember the quote. After the collapse of socialism in the Soviet Union, inferior plants and animals, this is the message, have simply no more chance to improve their condition. Some species are more noble than others, and there is no way to escape this matter of fact. Here we have a natural metaphor, clearly, of society. We're talking about rocks, so it's a natural metaphor of society, whereby everything perpetuates itself as identical to itself. All that we can obtain is just a continuous repetition of the same. The world does not contemplate any possibility of change. By merely reproducing itself, everything equals one. In other words, there can be no class struggle in natural science, remember Platonov, insofar as there can be no class struggle in nature. And there can be no class struggle in society because society should correspond to nature, especially if we found out the right genes and what they are responsible for. There is a certain natural order of things which must be followed. We can pretend to change it only by means of violence, blood, and terror. And even if we do so, things will nevertheless finally come back to their present state. In 1988, the Soviet director Vladimir Borko shot a film based on Mikhail Bulgakov's novel Heart of a Dog. The action takes place in Moscow not long after the October Revolution. A well-off professor experiments a new kind of surgery by transforming a stray dog, Sharik, into a man. But after his transition to human is complete, the dog turns the life of the professor into a nightmare, and the latter, the professor, is forced to reverse the procedure. Sharikov becomes a dog again. As Alexei Pentin points out, and I quote Alexei, in the era of perestroika, this novel became a real machine of the state, or a kind of ideological apparatus. Like a magnifying glass, this apparatus concentrated in a burning ray of hatred, blindness, and often simple stupidity, turning it to the very base of the great post-revolutionary culture of the 1920s. End of quote. Russian intelligentsia identified Sharikov in the post-Soviet early 90s with a certain anthropological type produced by revolution. That is to say, the proletarian, qua, we could say, the bastard. The morale was simple. Dogs generate dogs, worms generate worms, proletarians generate proletarians, and bastards generate bastards. One cannot generate a man out of a dog. One cannot generate a man out of a proletarian. And most, what one gets is a bastard. The slogan of the 1960s, socialism, remember, with a human face, paved the way, quite literally, to the conclusion that socialism cannot have a human face, but an animal face. Admittedly, Bulgakov's novel is also a satire targeted at Ivan Pavlov. By the way, Pavlov in the 50s was a staunch supporter of Lysenko. Yeah. Bulgakov's novel is also satire targeted at Ivan Pavlov, the Soviet physiologist who experimented on dogs. The phrase Pavlov's dog has itself become a swear word, not just in Russia, but in the West as well, and a metaphor for cruel experimentation on nature intended to materialize the utopia of a new man. At the more sophisticated level of artistic reflection, a similar critique can be found in the work of Oleg Kulik, who during the 1990s was working a lot with animals and even seriously tried to transform himself into a dog. One of his most radical performances was indeed called Pavlov's Dog. What Kulik did, this is Oksana's point, as an artist could be characterized as a kind of counter-utopia directly opposed to the utopia of the early Soviet revolutionary avant-garde, whereby animals were being transformed, emancipated into humans. As Renata Salets has it, talking about Kulik, his counter-utopia follows the principles of deep ecology. So there's also like a kind of like siding with deep ecology, the radical ecological stance of the West, of some Western theoreticians. And is theoretically based on an only alleged denunciation of anthropocentrism. Ludmila Bredikina, Kulik's ex-wife and a collaborator of his, explains, for instance, that true democracy can only be based on the law of the jungle. So let's go back to pre-Hobbes, for which the human being is just one animal species among others. Humans should rehabilitate the animal in them, this is the point. Their natural origin, that is to say, following Drusilla, transform back from reflective to reflex being. Returning to Platonov quickly to conclude, we cannot neglect the figure of a man that becomes an animal, which appears in his novel Rubbish Wind, written later in 1934. Here the Russian writer, we believe, anticipates the possible, but far from necessary, relapse of utopia into counter-utopia. So the argument here is that Platonov, as both, in a sense, anticipates both opposite ends of the spectrum, not only the utopian emancipation, liberation of animal into man, but also the opposite counter-utopia reactionary movement of the impossibility of that change, and hence, in a sense, of the animalization of man himself. The main character, Rabbi Schwinn Albert Lichtenberg, a physicist who studies cosmic space, transforms himself step by step into an indefinite animal, as he is unable to live as a human in Nazi Germany. He finds his last refuge in an animal body, which no one can recognize. And if in the sea of youth, the zoo technician Vysokovsky was dreaming that the evolution of animal kingdoms stopped in former times, I'm quoting, will recommence, and all poor creatures being covered with hair, who are now living in distemper, will finally achieve the fate of a conscious life. This is the utopian pole. In Rabbi Schwinn, the counter-utopian pole, we witness the reverse process. A man becoming covered with hair and losing his sanity, then being put into a concentration camp for not being sufficiently human. Class struggle, even for Platonov, seems to be lost in nature. But should we, open question, stick to this point of failure? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Any questions or comments?
Thank you.
But as I understood, you use this discourse of Lysenko mostly as an instrument to criticize those liberal subject discourse of being. Means has very specific functional orientation, so Jake exists. But maybe but also you mentioned Latvian school, university and master. Could we, my question, could we speak about fighting between two discourses in their logic, semantic, and so on?
Yeah, my point about the university discourse with regard to Lysenkoism, and you perfectly summarized my point about Lysenkoism, is to say I'm actually adopting him in a critical manner. In terms of the university discourse, what I try to emphasize is precisely the fact that it's very difficult to distinguish and detach the moment at which the critique of the university discourse brought about, according to some readings, both scientific and political, by Lysenko, turned into not only another version of the university discourse, but in a sense, almost the epitome of the university discourse. And here you have like a nice connection with Lacan. I mean, for Lacan, if you remember like Seminar 17, when he speaks about the university discourse, which is the embodiment of the master discourse in our contemporary society, he doesn't distinguish between the two blocks. He says the university discourse rules both in the capitalist world and in Soviet Russia. And it speaks precisely about the bureaucratic apparatus of science in Russia, to give a concrete example of what he believes university discourse is. And of course, we are talking about the same years. We're talking about the late 60s, so Lysenkoism was in decline, but at the same time was still an integral part of a certain ideological establishment. So you talked about, you said like an opposition between two discourses. I think the point from a psychoanalytical Lacanian theory of discourses, the point is actually to actually try and think what is the transition between one discourse and the other. And the way in which, because psychoanalysis itself proposes to be a transitional discourse. It's not like that discourse which is there to stay. There are specific historical coordinates that allow its emergence and development. So I would say, in a sense, from a psychoanalytical perspective, if we try to think of Lysenkoism as a failed cultural revolution, the point is not so much when did it fail, but what was the cultural revolution component of Lysenkoism? Because I think this gives you the idea of what a transition between different discourses can be. I don't know if I got you right in the question. Yeah.
Because a lot of things depend how they describe the message discourse. Because it's not so there are so many.
Yeah, but of course, the very quick definition of the university discourse, according to Lacan, is a discourse which has knowledge in the position of the agent, in the position of the master. The university discourse is a discourse which ultimately prioritizes, if not only, well, not only prioritizes, but completely focuses on the accumulation of knowledge. This is the point. Yeah.
I have a comment or question. First of all, thank you.
Thank you.
I agree with most of what you said. Well, first of all, I think that the historical and political meaning of Lysenkovism should maybe be spelled out in more detail, because it was a little lost. Because obviously there was a political message which was not only Lysenko's, but also, for example, was characteristic for pedology. I don't know if you're aware of this movement of the 30s, which wanted to transform pedagogy from similar point of view, from the point of view that there is no such thing as a nature of a child, her capabilities, but they all can be developed, etc. So it was an activist approach to nature, which you mentioned.
Yep.
And it was linked to the idea that everything can be transformed by the society and should be transformed. So in this sense, it was a part of a general ideology. But interestingly, Stalin had a very diverse asynchronous policy with regard to different movements of this kind. For example, pedology was destroyed in the already in the mid-30s, while Lysenko was twice affirmed. In linguistics, there was a strange avant-garde movement of Mark, which was closer to genetics because it had these atoms of language, but it was as crazy as Lysenko's from the point of view of the mainstream. And then also Stalin crushed it, and then he had his own linguistic theory in the late 40s, which was actually closer to Lysenko's methodology, which it was more active. So it was a general struggle of ideas even within Stalinism. But obviously the idea was political. The more interesting part. The more interesting part was the idea that you can develop nature. Now, this is an obvious idea, and you cannot argue against it in principle, right? You can argue on the fact that there is also stumbling reality, some kernel of the real that you cannot change.
Sure.
So that's kind of the voice of the ratio, which you can address to Lysenko and to Vygotsky, who was one of the pedologists.
Okay, so you had Vygotsky in mind.
But Vygotsky was not alone. It was a social movement.
Vygotsky, whom, by the way, is being read quite widely now in debates in biopolitics in Italy.
Unlike Lysenko, Vygotsky is a figure of establishment. He was recognized, but he is a political figure of the time, and also very critical with regard to the mainstream science. So, and making similar points to Lysenko. But what I'm saying is that my point that I'm trying to make is that can't you see a priori that these are two perspectives on the real? In physics, notably, they have been reconciled somehow. Because in physics there was similar clash, basically two philosophical, political trends that obviously pointed in a direction, but physicists, being maybe better philosophers than biologists, they saw that these are a priori positions, and so then there was the compromise in Heisenberg, etc. But there has been no, and maybe there was a similar compromise in the theory of evolution with the introduction of the ideas of aromorphosis, because now the current Darwinism is not Darwinism. They don't believe that everything is incremental adaptation.
Yeah.
Right? So there was a similar thing. But still we have the ideas that genes determine endocrinian and similar bullshit, which doesn't work simply logically. My point is that maybe you rely a little too much on the reference to science as the figure of the master or university, because you were saying, oh yeah, but science also proves it. But what if it what if it didn't?
Sure.
I mean, even if they prove in thousands statistical studies that people with a gene X have a religion, I mean, this will not make me believe these as true. So,
no, it's interesting that you say that, because it maybe depends on the audience, but no, I was not trying to actually prove Lysenko's possibility or partial possibility by endorsing myself for the scientific discourse. And this is why I opposed, actually I juxtaposed, because they're saying more or less the same thing. Levinson, Levanty on the one hand, and Badiou, and the political. But yes, my point is not to try and show how contemporary science, even if I understand I can give that impression, shows that after all Lysenko was not that wrong. I mean, more generally, I think science in this kind of research should have, yes, a prevalent position, but it's just like one voice amongst others, because of course, as you said, the historical and the social context is incredibly important, which leads me to your first point. Clearly, I have to, especially in this second version of the paper, and which is still a work in progress and will have to be expanded, I had to limit my cultural and historical considerations, and I'm very much aware of the fact, as I hinted at in the presentation, that of course Lysenko didn't come out of the blue. I mean, what early Soviet science, given the specific cultural and political climate, even in the early Stalin years, late 20s, what that specific context allowed is a negotiation between two a priori paradigms, which are still with us today. That is to say, bluntly put, straight genetic Darwinism, which is not Darwin for a simple reason, because Darwin comes before Mendel and Morgan. And on the other hand, certain lingering trends of neo-Lamarckism, which were even in the 20s and 30s much more complex than the usual vulgata, the detractory vulgata against Lamarckism makes us believe, okay? So clearly, Lysenko inserted himself in a certain context, and in a sense, up until, and this is more a cultural and historical consideration, up until 1948, even if you read like the reports from the genetics congresses, etc., up until 1948, Lysenko didn't win. I mean, even Stalin himself, even though he was supporting implicitly Lysenko and clearly exterminating, exiling a lot of his opponents, including especially Vavilov, his former mentor, up until 1945, Lysenkoism did not become a regime ideology. So this gives us, again, an idea of the level of debate that was ongoing in the 30s, even during the purges, in a sense. Just to make some names, for instance, on the Lysenko side, of course, you do have all the work, crazy work of Williams in agrobiology, who is the guy that basically said that fertilizers are not needed. So, you know, like in all collective farms, you have like specific maps of how can I put it, like the nature of soil and specific calculation to establish what is best to be grown where. And there has been like interesting papers showing how in the end, like fertilizers were introduced on a mass scale in the Soviet Union only because of the war, because of course the fertilizing industry is very close to producing weapons, in a sense, you know. So after World War II, on the other side of the spectrum, you had not only we're talking about the life sciences, not even pedagogy, etc. You have, of course, Vavilov, but also figures such as Koltsov, early experiments on, for instance, like sex mutations in insects. But also like very, very complex figures, and he is one of my favorite, the American Muller. He was a self-declared socialist. He came to the Soviet Union, I think, in 28 and 30s. But he was himself a Morganian Mendelian. He won a Nobel Prize in medicine in 48 for his work on Drosophila. So a straightforward Morganian Mendelian scholar. All these people clearly were fighting a battle for what we could call scientific hegemony. So I think my point is, to go back to the early Soviet era, is that the space open by the space for discussion and problematization of what were some scientific hegemonic ideas outside the Soviet Union was so wide that Stalinism itself, it took for Stalinism itself more than a decade and the war to impose one vision. So I'm not even sure whether, you know, like in the late 30s, I mean, there's been some speculation about that in the end, you know, like Lysenkoism was preferred over other attempts at mediating dialectical materialism and genetics, because there are a lot of those attempts as well, because of Stalin's predilection for gardening. You know, this is an easy way out, but in a sense, what I'm trying to make, my point more generally, is that given the complexity of the cultural and social context, very little would have sufficed to, as you pointed out with regard to other fields, to adopt the opposite paradigm as the official paradigm. This is my point. And one last issue, because you said like the point on physics is very interesting, because of course there is a new, what is called the great synthesis of the 30s, carried out especially by British biologists. That is to say, to put it very bluntly, for those of you who do not know it, how science, life sciences put together Darwin with Mendel. Because of course Mendel came after Darwin, and this became the doxa, which is still the doxa that dictates, in a sense, newspaper articles about we found a gene, etc., etc. What is increasingly clear if you read philosophy of biology, theoretical biology, but also to the extent that one can understand it, because at times it becomes very complicated, experimental work carried out by so-called developmental evolutionary biologists. It's clear that biologists today, some of them, but they are quite mainstream if they publish with MIT Press, are looking for what they call a new synthesis. So I think, and this is the debate you raised, the fact that, of course, physics found that synthesis, which reconcile what philosophically seems to be irreconcilable, two completely a prioristically different views on the real. This is a very, very heated debate going on in the life sciences today, especially with the emergence of so-called evo-devo, evolution developmental biology, and clearly all the discoveries in epigenetics. I mean, we briefly touched on that in the presentation when we talked about, you know, if neuronal connections are, and then of course stupidly one can statistically 80% dependent on the development of the organism and hence on the environment. How do we draw a distinction between phenotype and genotype? This is what is being problematized today as a philosopher, what I can understand, in very important debates in biology. This division between genotype and phenotype doesn't hold any longer.
And everything is ruined.
Exactly. No, there is one specific author which I think is incredibly interesting for a philosopher, West Eberhard, Mary Jane West Eberhard, and she has this book on. It's West, like West. I think it's Mary. I think Mary or Mary Jane West Eberhard. Yeah, something like that. The book, it's a 2005 book which has become sort of Bible in these circles. It's something like developmental biology and plasticity, something like that. Remember, like one of the first debates that Lysenko put to the fore in the early 30s was about what goes by the name of vernalization.
What?
Vernalization. No, vernalization, that is to say the planting, basically the planting of wheat varieties that are winter varieties in spring. Okay. Vernalizacja, how do you say? I think it's vernalizacja, something like that in Russian. It's taken from Russia. But that debate, which became, like he famously planted one specific crop at his father's farm, and then claimed, of course, that the result was excellent, etc., etc., and that there was all spinning, as we would say today, in terms of the result, which were very poor indeed. But the theoretical debate there, which I find interesting, even though, of course, he's not a talented scientist, he's a crass scientist, but he made this distinction between development and growth. I mean, talking about plants, I mean, growth is not development. So, in a sense, if we, by, for instance, using exposition to heat or other environmental factors, manipulate the plant, we can obtain some results. For instance, like make crops that are usually planted in winter, plant them in the spring, etc., etc. I mean, I always find that there is a quite, well, underneath you find like quite relevant philosophical points, even regarding debates that seem to be almost anecdotal by now. That is to say, how to plant wheat crops which are of the winter type in spring, etc., etc. And then, of course, I mean, plasticity. I think even I think in Russian is something similar. I mean, plasticity by now, not only in evolutionary developmental theory, but in continental philosophy, plasticity is the new term. It's with Catherine Malabou trying to find a connection between the cognitive sciences and a sort of post-Derridian philosophy. Plasticity is with us, in a sense. I think there was a question.
Was Alec?
I really like the presentation. Actually, I would like to see the text eventually.
Sure.
Somewhere. The problem by the audience could have been larger is that simultaneously there's a professor at MIT giving a class on SES, which has affected the nature of audience. We've been here, so 25 students right now are sitting in another room.
Okay.
And what they're discussing is different versions of, STS, in particular emphasis on active network theory.
On what?
Actor network. Latu.
Okay. Oh yeah. Sure.
So I'm listening to you and different versions of attention, which the writers and the theorists of the Russian Revolution gave to the agency of grass, like proletariat, or animals like people, or things, or your analysis of Platonov. I mean, I was kind of sitting and reminding myself of the analysis of Platonov, which is usual for Russian literary analysis, which basically says that he applies a very specific technique of anti-formalism, of non-estrangement. I don't know whether it was translated into English nowadays, but I don't know that. The aesthetics of non-estrangement.
Yeah,
but it's in Russian, I'm not sure whether it's available in English.
She wrote it in America, though, I'm sure it's translated.
Anti-formalism.
So basically there, what she claims is that we can never figure out whether there's a theme or people acting, whether phenomena in Platon's novel are of human and non-human kind very often, and that's what makes life really not surprises, and it's kind of a non-estrangement to us. So my long rambling question would end with emphasis standpoint of dialectic or philosophical debates at the time or nowadays on how about you and there wasn't embedded in 77 and 95, but rather in terms of the questions which are interesting for what is like Bruno Latour and Platonov ascribing agency to networks rather than humans, or would you see the whole listening affair some kind of a different nexus or
connection, basically a connection with bluntly put, you're saying like a connection with Latour. Difficult question, I would say. Clearly, I think what I'm trying to do shares with a certain Latourian critique is what I could call a certain debunking or demystification of the truth of laboratory experiments based on alleged empirical objectivity. Because I've developed on this. For instance, one of the 3 or 4 points which are present throughout the Lysenkoist literature, and maybe the most convincing, in addition to the critique of idealism, the proposition of creative Darwinism, and more dialectical materialist considerations about the change of quantity into quality in evolution, is the critique of statistics. The critique of statistics, I think, is, in terms of like our contemporary interests, anti-ideological interests in the life sciences, is possibly the most interesting element to be recuperated from that debate. Clearly, a critique of statistics is, if brought to an extreme, clearly also a critique of the alleged truth that are based on the alleged scientific objectivity of labs. So I know it's a loose connection, but you know, I mean, going back to Latour's original breakthroughs, I think this can be a connection. And again, I think like somebody like Stephen Jay Gould is very important here, because arguably one of the most popular books by Gould, and in my opinion maybe the best, The Mismeasure of Man, is nothing but radical critique. It's an old book by now, 86, I think. Now there's a new edition. He rewrote a longer edition before dying, but it's basically a staunch critique of statistics, showing not only how statistics is one with social determinism, or it can be one with social determinism, but also that statistics, in a sense, is the product of the legacy of a certain eugenic approach to the life sciences, in a sense. What else? Well, something else I wanted to say about statistics. Just slipped my mind. I mean, an anecdote, I think, there is a discussion between, which has been recently, a lot of the debates, official debates of the 30s and even the 48 infamous ban on genetics are now even available in English. Some historians of science, there's a guy called Rolf Hansen, a Swedish historian of science, have collected all the exchanges, in a sense. At times they are completely grotesque, but at times they quite capture the point in a very stupid, banal manner. So you have, for instance, present, I think, attacking that point, Keller. Keller was also another geneticist, quite famous, that ended up badly in those years. His point is basically, statistics is not a science, and he makes the following example. He says, well, you work on Drosophila, okay. You're trying to determine how many genetic mutation you obtain after such and such exposure to X-rays, which was cutting-edge science in those years. But then you have, in the end, to decide whether, you know, like that specific trait is X or Y. Say, bombardment with X-rays, and then the wings of the Drosophila, instead of being black, they are gray. And then you have like 10 specimens, and you have to make some calculation. And he said, well, this to me is the same thing as actually taking 10 loaves of bread, putting them in the oven, baking them, and then taking them out and ask somebody, could you please tell me whether they are big or small? Now, this is clearly not scientific reasoning, but I think in terms of the critique of ideology, it can be developed in a much more constructive way. And it's not so far from the debunking of statistics that somebody like Gould has developed. And of course, let's be clear, Gould has a very, very clear argument. He says, okay, statistics is by now supporting the entirety of not only life sciences, but of many social sciences, say sociology. You know, like first-year students in sociology and psychology, like in biology, have to go through factor analysis, for instance, which is specifically what Gould targets. Factor analysis as a mathematical method, fine with me. But the point is, like, the way in which factor analysis, which as a mathematical method works, is actually used ideologically. And this is what we read in scientific popular literature every day. You know, like, one thing is saying you have this number of vectors and this number of factors, and then you have certain ratios of values between different results. Another thing is saying, well, from this test, we can assess somebody's intelligence. Of course, I mean, referring to the old IQ debate. I think this is still really, really topical. But I know I just kept on talking about relative things. But to go back to your point, difficult question because I'm not a specialist on, I mean, I don't know that much about Latour. But I think, like, the link I would make between what I'm trying to do, especially with contemporary scientists that I think could dialogue or recuperate the Lysenkoist debate legacy, and Latour, would be a debunking of the alleged objectivity, the alleged objective truth that one supposedly can, based on alleged empirical evidence. You know? Yeah.
The most brilliant interpretation along these lines would be that the Cultural Revolution happened not when Lysenko wanted to force matter to submit to proletarian will and do products which are impossible by nature, even though he wanted to stage this Cultural Revolution and also change maybe the practice of experimentation based on dialectic and interpretation of natural philosophy. That would be, I think, the point close to the one right and their idea of Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
Cultural Revolution in Latour's interpretation would be that it was staged by Horn itself.
Horn,
which wanted to become a fine trade. And I mean, that when agency is described, you know, to things rather than humans, and can an inanimate object be subject of a cultural revolution? I mean, this poses a completely different set of questions in a sense. I mean, it sounds mad for a person who didn't read much of the literature, but I was just alerting that you to the fact that if you continue to work on subject matter, I still haven't seen a good analysis coming from Platonov, maybe just not knowledgeable. There's also very strange interpretations derived from a perspective in our lives. While applying to your subject matter.
No, I think the point you raised concerning methodology is quite interesting in relation to why the supposed cultural revolution that Lysenkoists strive for failed. Because as I said before, and I think here both the scientists and the political activists, Badiou and partners, agree. The point is, like, they very quickly ended up by opposing to official science different specific results. And that's the end of it, because in a sense, like, they never challenged, compete on their own territory. In a sense, not even in their own territory. They were disqualifying the methodology, as I said about statistics, but they didn't have a methodology. So when you have, like, mainstream scientists, even in the 30s, saying, well, but you don't have a methodology, clearly they do have a point there. There was no, that's the point, I mean, in a sense, and it goes back maybe to the question about discourses, because in a sense, if we go back not only to Lacan, but even like a more scientific idea of what I would call a scientific discourse and a theory of scientific discourse, say Kuhn, okay? I mean, clearly to oppose, to change the sign of a scientific statement is not enough, far from enough, to even allow the possibility of introducing a new paradigm. I think the question of methodology is really, really important. And I think this is also what people who are trying to merge the two traditions, not Lysenko and the non-Lysenkoists, but I would say more generally, the signifier Darwin and the signifier Lamarck are doing now. What they are doing now, I think they are really, really struggling with the problematization of the methodology. To give you like an anecdote, I read like a piece by a philosopher of biology who was very, very inclined to support this new developments in evolutionary developmental theory and the problematization of the strict dichotomy between phenotype and genotype, so the recuperation of some Lamarckian themes. But then it recurs to questionnaires to show how their ideology, the so-called, Lysenko would put it, Morganian Mendelian ideology, is so ingrained within us. Do you understand my point? So an attempt to criticize what we were criticizing before, say, that gene causes homosexuality, that gene causes, an attempt to criticize that is carried out by means of questionnaires.
There is a gene of Mendel's Morganism.
Yeah. Because in an attempt to show how this idea is so deeply ingrained in